Welcome to another Frontend Engineering Explained. This one is a little low on code and more about talking about kind of like process. So oftentimes when you're working on a ticket, when you're working on a project, you'll get assigned a ticket. And a lot of companies, most companies these days, I almost want to say all, but that's not entirely true, use some form of agile. So you usually have stuff like user stories, you have sprints, and maybe a little bit of Kanban with your usual boards with things moving across the Kanban boards. And user stories is one of those artifacts that you have as part of these processes. Now, user stories are very useful for multiple people. And especially if you're going to implement a new feature, it can be really useful because it gives you a way to think through what it is that you're about to implement before you write the code. And maybe you'll even have some questions as you read through it. Thing is, you don't always get a user story as part of a ticket that's being assigned to you. Like oftentimes in the rush of getting things done and moving things forward, you might get a very sparse ticket actually, and there's only some information there. Now, in this situation, you could go back to the project manager or product owner and say, hey, could you provide some more information? Could you perhaps write a user story and add that to the ticket? Or you could write one yourself. That's a little tricky depending on the amount of information you have. And then also, you could just start implementing with the information you have. And in a lot of cases, that might kind of be the best way forward because inevitably, as you start writing the code, you'll start hitting these corner cases. So you'll write a little bit of code, you'll try it out in the UI, and you'll be like, oh, wait a minute, but what if this happens or that happens? What if the user chooses to change the country and then this needs to update, but what if they've already filled in something? Then what happens? And that kind of thing. So you start going back and forth with yourself and you kind of update your code until you get to a place where maybe you have something like what I have here, which is kind of this form initialization thingy, that piece of code that you run when the page loads, and it does certain things depending on the options that was passed in, and it attaches an event handler, and when certain change events happen, it triggers some side effects. And you might get to this point and you might feel like, okay, I think this is pretty good. I reckon I've probably handling all the corner cases and I think this is good. And now you might go and add this and commit and push and then ask for code review. But now the person on the other end kind of sits in the same boat. They now need to review the code, but they also only have the little sparse amount of information to go on. And so they might have to ask you some questions if it's not immediately obvious in your code what it's doing. Of course, you should try and make your code as clean as possible, and we're going to touch on that in a second. But it's not super ideal. So what I did on a recent, well, literally this piece of code, is I thought, wait a minute, but what if I add this block of code, so this entire function, to the context, and I ask kind of an inverse from the AI, and I say, instead of like, here are some requirements, write a user story for me, I actually say, look at the code, and based on your understanding of the code and some of the context around the code, like maybe functions that this code calls, for example, here it calls the update dial code function, here it calls an update province state, write a user story for me. And it did that, and it actually was really, really useful. And that's why I wanted to share this with you in hopes that maybe it can be useful for you as well. So it did a couple of things. One thing it did is the first time I had to do this, it highlighted something that I was then like, oh, wait a minute. But what if the user does choose to do this thing? And that made me update the code a little bit. That made it a little, I want to say less fragile. Let's go with that. And then I basically made that change and say, okay, I made a change or two to the code. Can you please just look at the change and then update the user story as appropriate? It did that. And now I have a really nice user story here. So it says, as a website visitor filling out a form, I want the form to automatically pre-fill location-based fields based on my detected country, so that I can complete the form faster with less manual input and fewer errors. That's our user story. Now we're getting acceptance criteria, and this is super cool because this you could also use, well, a QA person can use this when they are validating what you've implemented. You can use this to drive a test, like an end-to-end test. You can basically go through these steps when you do your end-to-end test and make sure that it then asserts true at the end of it. And this, of course, can also be very useful for the person who needs to review your code. And at the end, when you copy this and you now put it in that ticket, now also the product owner or the project manager, or maybe the person who filed the ticket, can read through this and be like, oh my goodness, yeah, this is exactly actually what I wanted. Or they can actually say, oh, you know what? This made me think of this other situation that maybe you wouldn't have known by maybe you're new to the project, or maybe there's just like external things. Often when working with a client as opposed to working at a product company, there's some stuff that client knows that you don't necessarily know. But anyway, so looking at the acceptance criteria. So given I'm on a form page with location-based fields, when the page loads, then the system should detect my country using the API location endpoint. That's getting a little technical, but it's fine. Pre-fill the country field with my detected country code, pre-fill nationality if it is enabled, pre-fill the phone number if it's enabled, disable the province field based on whether my country has a province. And then it just lists which of these countries will have a province. And then make the province field required and enable only if my country has provinces. And then given I change the country selection, when I select a different country from the dropdown, then the system should update the phone number field's dialing code while preserving any additional digits I may have entered, enable or disable the province field based on the new country selection, update the province field's required state accordingly. Given the location detection fails, when the API returns an error or an invalid response, the system should fall back to Italy as the default country and still pre-fill all fields with the fallback country's data. And then it made some technical notes. This is not so interesting for using it in your ticket, but it says the function handles 3 optional field types: number, phone number, province. It uses a comprehensive country to dialing code mapping. That's right at the top of this function. Province field are only relevant for Italy, Spain, and Portugal. The function sets up event listeners for dynamic updates when country changes. The province field is enabled based on country selection. Phone number updates preserve user input by replacing only the dialing code portion. So now you can, like I said, you can copy this, you can paste it into the issue, you can open your merge or your pull request, and you can ask for review. Now the person reviewing your code has this to look at and read through. This might also get them thinking and them asking some questions about it. The QA person that needs to now QA the code once it's gone to stage, they can reference this when they need to test and make sure that the implementation is correct. And you can also ask the PMPO or the person that logged the ticket, hey, this is what I implemented. Did I address all the items that you were thinking of? And they can come back and say yes, or they can ask for you to add some additional things, and you can build out on this base and then implement any additional changes or features that might have been missed in the first go round. So I thought this was really useful, and it's something that I'll be doing more going forward, because the other thing that I failed to mention is what's nice about this is the fact that the AI could deduce a clear and cohesive user story from looking at the code. Might also be a really good signal that the code is clear and understandable. Which means that when the person reviewing your code looks at the code, they won't have a bunch of questions about what and why things are happening. It would be pretty clear. And especially if you then couple that with this user story and acceptance criteria, just makes everybody's life a lot easier. I hope you found this useful and that you can use this in your daily work, even if it's on side projects. It's still super useful because you never know, tomorrow somebody joins your side project and now you already have this kind of stuff in place that also shows why things are the way they are, what the thinking process were, and so forth and so forth. So let me know if this was useful to you. And if you like more content like this, and of course, all the other usual stuff that's much more code heavy, then hit that subscribe button, give this a like. And until the next one, build awesome things for the web, and I will see you soonish. Peace.